Welcome back. Today, we're digging into one of history's greatest military upsets, how the mighty British Empire, the undisputed superpower of its day, actually lost America. And let me tell you, the answer is way more shocking and frankly a lot more dysfunctional than anything you probably learned in school. You see, back in the 18th century, war was supposed to be a game of honor. It was a spectacle, played by gentlemen in these bright red coats. You'd line up in an open field, trade volleys, and you played by the rules. But in the deep, dark forests of North America, the colonists were about to teach the world's greatest empire a really brutal lesson. Honor gets you killed. So how did it all go so spectacularly wrong for the British? Well, in this explainer, we're going to break it down in 5 parts. We'll start with the battlefield chaos and the tactical mismatches that just baffled the British. Then we'll get into the toxic office politics that doomed the whole war effort from the inside. After that, we'll look at the shocking blowback on America's key ally, and finally, the wild, ironic consequences that rippled across the globe. All right, let's get into it. So the British roll up to America expecting a traditional European-style war. They've got their formations, their discipline, their bright red coats. But what they found was something they just couldn't wrap their heads around. It was a whole new kind of conflict where all the old rules were just thrown right out the window. They were up against one of history's first major examples of what we now call asymmetric warfare. And it's pretty simple when you think about it. The colonists knew they could never beat the British in a straight-up fight, army against army. So they didn't even try. Their goal wasn't to win a single battle. It was to win the whole war by refusing to fight on British terms and just dragging the empire into a messy quagmire it couldn't escape. And that leads us to our second point. This new style of fighting created an absolute nightmare for the British army. They were prepared to fight soldiers, but instead they found themselves fighting ghosts in a forest. So what did this new warfare actually look like on the ground? What were they dealing with? Well, for starters, the American militia was mostly made up of hunters. They'd modify their own rifles for better range and accuracy. They didn't wear uniforms, so they could hide in the woods, take a shot, and then just melt back into the civilian population. And, this is key, they specifically targeted British officers, a practice the British thought was totally cowardly and dishonorable. But it worked. Washington's army was famously undisciplined. Guys would literally just go home to harvest their crops. But that weakness became a weird kind of strength. The British could never find a central army to crush. It was like trying to punch water. Meanwhile, back in London, the guy in charge of the war, a secretary named George Germain, he had what seemed like a brilliant strategy on paper. The plan was called the Hudson River Cut. Basically, seize control of the Hudson, slice the colonies in two, isolate that radical hotbed of New England from everyone else, and just starve the revolution into submission. It was a classic divide-and-conquer strategy. So you have to ask, right? The plan was solid. The British had the naval power, they had the manpower to pull it off. So what went wrong? Well, a great strategy is completely useless if the people who are supposed to execute it are more interested in fighting each other than fighting the enemy. And that brings us to the real kind of hidden reason the empire lost America. And this is our third point, and it's maybe the most shocking reason for Britain's failure. See, it wasn't sealed on the battlefield. It was sealed in the petty arguments and egos of its own commanders. The British war effort was poisoned from the inside by a level of dysfunction and office politics that is just breathtaking. First up, you've got the guy back in London, George Germain. He's the one who came up with the master plan. Problem was, his generals in the field absolutely despised him. They saw him as a disgraced armchair general, and they pretty much just ignored his orders whenever they felt like it. He had the title, but no real authority. Then there's the commander-in-chief in America, General William Howe. He was supposed to move his army up the Hudson to meet another force coming down from Canada. But instead, on a whim, he decided it would be much more glorious to go capture the colonial capital, Philadelphia. He did it, but in the process, he totally abandoned his part of the plan, leaving the other general, Burgoyne, completely isolated. That one decision led directly to the disastrous British surrender at Saratoga. So after Howe gets recalled, his replacement, Henry Clinton, inherits this total mess. But he's got his own problem. He's locked in this bitter feud with his ambitious, insubordinate second-in-command, a guy named Charles Cornwallis. Their relationship was so toxic, it basically paralyzed the entire command structure. And finally, there's Cornwallis himself. He gets sent to run the war in the South and just acts like a complete rogue agent. He'd win these small, flashy battles that didn't really matter, all while completely bypassing his direct boss, Clinton, to talk directly with London. I mean, it was a total breakdown of the chain of command. Now, this slide here lays out the whole toxic dynamic perfectly. It's like a corporate flowchart from hell. Germain can't control Howe ditches the plan for personal glory. Clinton can't control Cornwallis, and Cornwallis just does his own thing. This wasn't an army. It was a dysfunctional project team that was doomed from the start. And all this infighting led directly to Cornwallis marching his army straight into a trap at Yorktown, where he got cornered by American and French forces, and that, for all intents and purposes, was the end of the war.
So, Britain's defeated at Yorktown. You'd think the story ends there, right? Happy victory for America and its friends. But the most ironic and kind of tragic twist was yet to come. And it happened to America's greatest supporter, the one country that made the victory possible, France.
Just look at this number. 1 billion leaves. That's how much France spent to help America win. It was a completely astronomical sum, an act of geopolitical revenge against their old enemy, Britain, for losing a previous war. They literally bankrolled the American Revolution. So what did France get for this massive investment? Well, this is where the story takes a really stunning turn. Guys like Benjamin Franklin, playing the master diplomat in Paris, had secured France's total commitment, their money, their navy, their soldiers. France went all in. But the second victory was in hand. The American diplomats secretly went behind their allies' backs. They went straight to the British and signed their own separate peace treaty, getting an incredibly sweet deal for America and leaving the French with nothing but a giant mountain of debt. And this timeline just lays out the devastating consequences. It's a crazy butterfly effect. France got its revenge, sure, but the cost was its own financial ruin. The debt from the American War directly led to the bankruptcy of the entire French state. To fix the crisis, King Louis XVI was forced to call a meeting to raise taxes, and that event spiraled out of control and became the French Revolution. So, in the ultimate irony, the king who helped America win its freedom ended up losing his own head on the guillotine. And the fallout didn't even stop with France. The end of the war created a new world for everyone involved, often in deeply ironic and unexpected ways that nobody could have possibly predicted when those first shots were fired. So let's just recap the final ripple effects. As we've seen, America's victory came at the direct expense of France, which was left bankrupt and spiraling into its own revolution. But there were other consequences too. Thousands of colonists who had stayed loyal to Britain fled north, and their migration is what really cemented Canada's identity as a pro-British nation. And maybe most tragically, Britain's Native American allies, who had fought alongside them, were completely abandoned in the peace treaty, left to face the unstoppable westward expansion of the brand new United States. You know, when you look back at the whole conflict, it really teaches us a timeless and powerful lesson. Britain didn't lose America just because of guerrilla tactics or French help. At its core, Britain lost America because its own arrogance prevented a political solution when one was still possible. It tried to solve a political problem with military force, and it sent an army that was fighting the wrong war, led by generals who were too busy fighting each other. And this all leaves us with a really fascinating ethical question that historians still debate today. Was Benjamin Franklin a patriot doing what was necessary, or was he a ruthless pragmatist? Was betraying France, the nation that saved them, a justifiable move to get the best possible future for the United States? What would you have done in his shoes? Let us know what you think down in the comments. I'd love to read your take on it. Thanks so much for joining us for this explainer. If you enjoyed untangling this messy, complicated, and absolutely fascinating piece of history, make sure you subscribe to the channel and hit that notification bell so you don't miss our next deep dive into the stories that truly shaped our world.